Carrie, I see we're streaming. Is that right? Are we good to go? Carrie? Carrie, right now the screen is trapped in an edit screen. All right, Carrie, are we good to go? Sorry guys, we're just gonna hang tight for one more second. Okay, I think we are good to go. All right, I'm calling this hearing to order. Good morning, everybody. My name is Kenzie Bach, and I'm the Vice Chair of the Committee on Housing and Community Development. At the request of the Chair of the Committee, which is Councillor Lydia Edwards, I'll be chairing this hearing today. In accordance with Chapter 20 of the Acts of 2021, modifying certain requirements of the open meeting law and relieving public bodies of certain requirements, including the requirement that public bodies conduct its meetings in a public place that is open and physically accessible to the public, the City Council will be conducting this hearing virtually. This enables the Council to carry out our responsibilities while adhering to public health recommendations and ensuring public access to our deliberations through adequate alternative means. The public may watch this meeting via live stream at www.boston.gov/city-council-tv or via broadcast on Xfinity 8, RCN 82, and FiOS 964. The public hearing is being recorded and live streamed on it will also be rebroadcast at a later date on those channels. Anybody who would like to testify on this matter today, you can email juan.lopez@boston.gov for the Zoom link to testify live. That's juan.lopez@boston.gov. You can also email Juan with testimony after the fact. So if you watch this at a later date and you want to submit written testimony, the committee will continue to collect that. Today's hearing is on docket 1024, which is an order for a hearing to review rental unit condition standards and inspections in the city of Boston. It's a matter sponsored by Councillor Liz Braden from District 9, Councillor Lydia Edwards, District 1, and myself, Councillor Kenzie Bach from District 8, and it was referred to the Committee on Housing and Community Development on September 29th, 2021. I'm joined by several of my colleagues, Councillor Liz Braden, who, as mentioned, is the lead sponsor of this matter, and then also Councillor Julia Mejia at large and Councillor Ed Flynn of District 2. We're also really looking forward today to hearing from a number of other cities that have attempted parallel things to what we're thinking about here. So I will introduce them at the appropriate moment, but I just want to say right from the start that we're really pleased that we're going to focus on from New York, Toronto, and Chicago to talk with us about what they've done in tackling similar challenges. But I think I really want to start out by ceding the floor to the lead sponsor just to speak a little bit about how this hearing came to be and what the challenges are that we're seeing in our neighborhoods. And I'll give councillors a very brief moment for opening remarks and then turn the floor over to Chief Dion Irish, who's with us and his staff in the Inspectional Services Department. So Councillor Braden, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm not on video at the moment. The host needs to let me in this video. Can you hear me?
Yeah, Carrie, is there anything we can do about that?
It doesn't matter. I can speak.
Okay. Yeah, why don't you go ahead, Councillor Braden, and we'll try to fix that before the next round.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It really is, this is a perennial concern in our district in Alston Brighton. We have a huge amount of rental property, and much of it is rented to students and young professionals. Some of them are renting for the first time. And we also have this huge changeover of rentals in the end of August and beginning of September. And every year we hear these horror stories about bad living conditions, infestations from rodents, buildings that aren't up to code. And I know that our inspection services department has a valiant effort to try and keep on top of all this, but I think it's just the sheer volume of rental properties, and that there are certain landlords who are perennial offenders, chronic offenders, in the sense that they pay the fines and then just continue to re-rent out their properties without making the necessary improvements to bring their buildings up to more livable standards. So I feel this is an opportune moment to just review what we're doing right now, learn from our colleagues in other cities what they're doing, and see if there's any other actions that we need to take as a council and as a legislative body to tighten up our program, our methods here, so that we can guarantee to our resident population that the housing is of a more livable standard. So I really look forward to the conversation this morning, and thank you for your partnership in this endeavour. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you so much, Councillor Braden, for leading and filing this. Councillor Mejia, and then Councillor Flynn, and then we've also been joined by Councillor Ricardo Arroyo from District 5. So Councillor Mejia, you want to make a brief opening statement? Sorry, we've got...
Hi, sorry. Yes, I'd like to make some brief opening remarks. So thank you to the chair and to the sponsors for calling this hearing order. You know, I always talk about the fact that I bounce from place to place, from house to house growing up, and I did see my fair share of rental units in our city. Renters come from all backgrounds, from college students to families to senior residents to immigrants to low-income residents and more. And all of them deserve to be living in the best possible housing. And we have a responsibility as city councilors to ensure that we're doing the best that we can to house people in safe conditions. And so, you know, I think as we continue to have this conversation, I'm really curious around accountability and transparency. So looking forward to diving into the conversation and figuring out what are some viable solutions so that we can move the conversation forward. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Councillor Mejia. Councillor Flynn? Councillor Flynn, you're coming in on the phone. You'll need to, I think, press *6. There we go.
Good morning, Councillor Block. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Oh, thank you, Councillor Block, and to the sponsors of this important hearing order. I agree with my colleague, Councillor Braden, that we have to make sure we provide the apartments that are up to code, but also making sure that these apartments are safe. Public health is a factor, in public safety. We don't want to see tenants subleasing these and adding more people into an apartment. We want to make sure that public safety and public health are also part of this discussion as well. And my other point that I wanted to highlight too is we have to continue to work closely with inspectional services to make sure we provide residents with clean apartments, with safe apartments for them and their families. But it also, we also have an obligation as city councilors to advocate for more funding for inspectional services during this upcoming budget process. They can't do it with the funding that they have right now. We're adding more and more to their plate, and we need to aggressively hire more inspectional services personnel and give them a budget so they can address these challenges across our city. Thank you, Councilor Buck.
Thank you, Councilor Flynn. And finally, Councilor Arroyo.
No opening. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much. And I'll just say, I think this is such an important issue. I think that, as we all know, housing is a complete necessity. And one of the really important things, we talk about a housing market and prices going up and up, but the other element to a market is it's very variable depending on whether you set real product standards or not. And I think the reality that we face is that renters, who are a majority of the city, can get caught in a terrible situation where both the price of the thing they're paying for is going up and the quality is going down. And the city really has an important regulatory function to keep the quality from going down, with landlords who just figure, as Councilor Braden said, I can just pay these fines. Because when people aren't in safe, sanitary, decent housing, it affects every aspect of their life, from their health and well-being to their ability to get to work, all kinds of things. And I just think that once somebody is in a housing unit, especially in a city with incredibly low vacancy rates, which have dropped right back to bottom, like after the brief blip early in the pandemic, the reality is that there's a real power imbalance there once somebody is in a unit and it turns out to be substandard. And so thinking about what is it as a city that we do that really changes behavior and makes landlords decide that it is actually too expensive and too burdensome to not comply, it, to me, is really important. And I know there's a number of things that our inspectional services are doing, but I know that we've also surveyed the field, and we feel like there might be some more aggressive stuff that we can try in Boston that our other colleagues in other cities are trying. So I just want to say that I'm really glad Councilor Braden filed this and happy to partner with her on it. And now I want to turn the floor over to Chief Irish to introduce his team, and then we'll hear a bit from the Inspectional Services Department about what we currently do in Boston. So Chief Irish, you have the floor.
Thank you, Councilor. Good morning. Good morning, Councilor Braden, and also Councilor Mejia and Councilor Arroyo and Councilor Flynn. Thank you all for this opportunity and for holding this hearing and giving us an opportunity to speak. This is also a personal matter for me, to be honest with you. I started my career with the city in 1995 as a housing inspector. I saw firsthand some of the conditions that some of our residents had to live through, and it made me passionate about public service, and it's fueled me ever since. And I certainly agree that housing is one of the most critical needs. I'm proud to say, though, over time we have seen improvements, but there's still a lot of work to be done, and no one should be living in any substandard conditions in a city such as Boston. I do want to share some brief background on this, because not only was I a housing inspector, but I also was an author and proponent for these policies that we're discussing today. So I can speak to the legislative intent and sort of reflect on where we are now before I turn it over to our talented team at ISD to really get into where we are now and what work is currently ongoing. Our delivery standards ordinance was developed, I think, around 2008, and the intent there was to address the issue of units being turned over in substandard, unsafe conditions at the time of moving. We wanted to not only be able to use our current enforcement policy was to document the conditions, give notice to the owner, time to correct. If they don't correct, then we take it to court, and fines are only available to us upon a trial and conviction. And most housing code cases don't actually go to trial. So that ordinance actually gave us the ability to issue fines if units weren't delivered in a clean and safe manner. And also from the cleanliness standpoint, we had, particularly in your district, Councilor Braden, families would come from other parts of the country, and move-in day, they'd move into an apartment that wasn't even clean. And technically, and housekeeping is a tenant's responsibility under the state sanitary code. That's why we created the delivery standards ordinance, to have a 48-hour window where housekeeping was, in fact, the owner's responsibility at the time of turnover. and they'd be fine if they didn't meet those standards. So we have seen improvement on that, but we still have work to do. The other ordinance I think that we'll be mainly focusing on today is the rental registration and inspection ordinance. And that ordinance was set up broadly to address two main things. One, to create a more proactive approach to ensuring that all of our residents have access to safe, healthy housing, and without the need to rely on filing complaints. Complaints is still a way for folks to ask us to take a look at their conditions, but we wanted something proactive, predictable as well. And something that also allowed us to work with good landlords. It also did an important thing of creating a database of contact information for folks who are renting property. Prior to that, we had to do title searches and have lawyers research ownership just to notify folks of things that they needed to address. Now with this database, we are able to be more proactive and it's improved our communication with property owners. And the good landlords fix things really quickly once they're notified, and sometimes even without the city being involved. So, you know, we have made some progress, but there's more work to be done. And our team will be happy to, you know, take you on a further journey to talk about where we are now. So with no further ado, I want to turn it over to our Assistant Commissioner of Housing Inspections at the ISD, Paul Williams. And after Paul, we'll have our Assistant Commissioner of Administration and Finance, Kelly Mackey, also provide some testimony. So, Paul?
Paul, you're muted.
I'm good. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Good morning. Thank you, Councilors Edwards, Bach, Braden, Flynn, Arroyo, and Mejia for calling this hearing and attending and allowing us to speak today. My name is Paul Williams, and I'm the Assistant Commissioner of Housing of the Housing Division here at Inspectional Services. I'm joined today by my colleague, Kelly Mackey, the Assistant Commissioner of Administration and Finance, and Evangeline Maxwell Davis, our Assistant Director of the Housing Division. I'd like to give an overview of ISD's rental housing regulations and programs. ISD's Housing Division works to ensure stable, safe, clean, and healthy environments for rental tenants. To that end, we operate several programs that involve registration, inspection, and complaint responses. As the council is aware, the Rental Registration Inspection Ordinance, Section 9-1.3 of the City's Code, was enacted to maximize the effectiveness of city resources in rental property code enforcement and provide a fair, predictable, and proactive system of ensuring the health, safety, and maintenance of Boston's rental units by inspecting, registering, and educating and assisting Boston's landlords. Core to the program is the requirement for all rental properties to register annually with ISD. Regardless of the number of units in the building, its owner occupancy status or vacancy, every rental housing unit must be registered. Owner-occupied buildings with 6 or fewer units are exempt from the registration fees and annual inspections, but must maintain active and current registration with the department. As of today, we have a little over 137,000 registered units, which accounts for approximately 72% of the rental housing stock in the city. Maintaining an up-to-date registry requires frequent communication with current registrants, along with consistent education and outreach to capture property transfer, new properties, etc. Current efforts include rental reminders throughout the year, registration renewal as part of the rental program inspection process. We do Boston Water and Sewer mailers, and we have social media campaigns. The department continues to strategize and identify opportunities to increase compliance with registration requirements through outreach and enforcement. To that end, we are working on several approaches, including required registration during a certificate of occupancy process, or proactive outreach to known new properties. Proactive outreach based on property transfers using assessing data, having incorporate registration checks as part of our complaint triage process. We continue to use Boston Water and Sewer mailers as means for growing awareness of our programs, and we have increased use of fines and property liens where necessary. In addition to registration requirements, the ordinance requires regular inspections of rental units. All non-exempt units must be inspected at least once every 5 years, and more frequent inspections are required for problem properties. Owner-occupied 6 or fewer unit properties are exempt from the inspection requirements. And the inspection requirements can be met through an inspection conducted by an ISD housing inspector, a BHA or certified inspector report, or through the alternative 5-year program. Based on our current registration data, approximately 125,000 registered units are subject to inspections, to the inspection requirement. This includes approximately 21,000 units of exempt properties. Our annual ISD inspection target is 10,000 units per year, and we currently have approximately 12,000 units pending selection in 2022. During the selection process, we weigh inspections towards property owners with prior existing inspection failures at other properties. Overall, we see the proactive rental inspection program as a success. Before the ordinance was adopted in 2012 and amended in 2014, only 2% of the roughly 20,000 annual inspections conducted by ISD for rental units turnover such proactive inspections. The other 98% of inspections were triggered by complaints. As we've increased the number of proactive rental inspections under the ordinance, we see a complementary reduction in the number of complaints-based reactive inspections that we need to respond to. Now I'd like to turn it over to Kelly Mackey to go over some of our public information responses and go over some of our technical challenges as well.
Good morning, councilors. Thank you for having us here today to discuss this important program. Before jumping into the technology aspects, I'd like to just briefly discuss some of the tools we have to enforce these programs. On the registration side, we do utilize fines to enforce compliance and ensure that folks are keeping their registrations up to date. But if violations are found in unit inspections, any issues with the unit standards, those need to be remedied by fixing the underlying issue. Fines do not address compliance in terms of actual issues and violations in the unit. So just want to stress that. From a public information standpoint, we are continuously looking to expand our outreach and education efforts for tenants. We want them to be aware of these programs and what's available at their fingertips in terms of city services. We know that tenants should be empowered with as much information as possible, both when they're looking for a new place to live and throughout their tenancy. Currently, ISD's complaint and code violation data feeds directly into the city's Rent Smart system. This system provides up-to-date information about every property in the city, including complaint and violation histories with the past 5 years. We think this is a great system for residents looking to understand their own property as well as the neighborhood, both when they're currently living there as well as when they're investigating places to live. And we believe there's some opportunities to expand the use of this system, including incorporating rental registration and inspection data in a way similar to how the history is available for food service establishments through the Mayor's Food Court program. Beyond investment in RentSmart, ISD has identified several additional areas for expanded use of technology to improve the efficiency and effectiveness of the rental program. Technology has been an integral part of running this program from the beginning. A rental registration database, online registration application, and inspector app were introduced when the rental program was originally rolled out. The city has invested heavily in the platforms that support these programs, including major systems, upgrades to our permitting and licensing, and 311 software. In recent years, ISD has adopted the city's 311 systems to manage incoming complaints, and we have launched a dedicated housing call center to manage incoming calls. That call center has taken over 20,000 calls since launching in August 2020. And it was really crucial to have that up and available to work remotely through the pandemic to be as responsible as possible to tenants. All of these foundational investments, as these foundational investments are completed, we're working closely with DoIT to continually improve the technology support of these programs based on constituent and staff feedback. A core challenge of managing a program of this scale has been maintaining accurate, consistent, and up-to-date information. Paul mentioned the number of units, the number of inspections we're doing. Just the scale of data management is a challenge and a very important feature of this program. An example that we run into is matching ownership information across registrations so we can provide a comprehensive view of a portfolio of properties owned by the same owner. Especially with our larger property owners or those working with property managers, we may see multiple team members managing those registrations, which makes it more difficult for us to get that comprehensive view and match all properties belonging to the same individual. We're continually working to improve our systems to address these challenges. For example, we've worked to refine our renewal messages to provide clear instructions with detailed steps on how to complete the process. And we're automating messages to allow for increased frequencies of reminders. These incremental changes have led to increased renewal rates in recent years, and just better, more up-to-date information. We're also planning for tech investments in our rental inspection programs. The rental inspections are completed via a mobile application, which gives us really detailed information on violations found in the fields. However, any reactive inspections are still captured on paper. We are in the process of moving those to a digital format so that we would have that information regardless of why the inspection was completed. We're also working towards opportunities to leverage technology in the selection and response process for the rental inspection program. Paul mentioned that we're currently working on a 12,000 unit selection going into 2022. Currently, we notify the owners via paper mailing and take response via paper forms returned to our staff. And then all of that scheduling is managed through back and forth via email and phone calls. Introducing some of this functionality to a portal to allow for response, payments, and submission of documentation could really realize some efficiencies in the administration of this program. And finally, Paul did address this as well, but there's a wealth of data available from our colleagues in other departments citywide that we've recognized as opportunities to help us with the compliance of this program. One area is working with DND. They have extensive information around housing starts and new units coming online, making sure that we're working with those property owners of new buildings to ensure that they are registering as soon as they're built is one opportunity that we're pursuing. Another is working with assessing and keeping an eye on change of ownership so that we can communicate with new owners about the requirements of this program. And with that, Chief, I can turn it back to you, but that is what we wanted to cover in terms of an overview before questions. But anything you'd like to add before opening for questions?
Nothing to add at this point. I'm looking forward to answering questions.
Great, thank you so much, Chief, and to the whole team for being on. We will go to counselor questions. I'll just note for counselors that we do have our next panel from Toronto, New York, and Chicago waiting to come on next. So urge everybody to ask the questions to the point. And also, I may at some point, we may be joined briefly by the public advocate from New York, Jermaine Williams, who just has a brief window. So if and when Jermaine arrives, I will briefly pause things in order to enable them to speak, because it won't, they can't stay for long. So, but we will go straight to Councillor Braden, the lead sponsor, to start out questions, and then it'll be Councillor Mejia. Councillor Braden.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, ISD team. Thank you, Dion, and thank you to your team for all the great work. You know, one thing that I'm hearing is that the reactive inspections are still captured on paper, and I know that that's a technological hurdle. Where are we at in terms of making that a more digital platform to capture the information and respond in terms of, and also in terms of investment, in terms of, you know, we're thinking about budgets already. You know, what other support do you need from the city to make that happen in a more effective way?
I'd be happy to take that one. That is a project that is currently in process. So we do have a prototype in place and are working to test that and establish a timeline for adoption. But that is resourced work.
That's good. And then, so the problem properties are always sort of top of your list for inspections. They get priority in terms of they get flagged as people who need, or properties that need a little more scrutiny on a regular basis rather than the 5-year cycle. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. That's built into our selection process to make sure that those are identified and are part of the annual selection process. But we want to make sure that as part of the 10 or 12,000 properties that we choose every year, that we prioritize those in the listing.
Can I add to that also that we established an investigation and enforcement team roughly 2 years ago, and that team keeps a list of like problem addresses that they monitor on an ongoing basis.
Okay. I think I used the wrong term. I used the wrong term. It's more chronic offenders rather than problem properties, because that's a whole other ballgame. That's a whole other thing. Thank you.
Councillor Braden, can I break in for a second? As I mentioned, we've been joined by Jermaine Williams, who is the public advocate for New York, a former city councillor in New York. And we're honored that he's able to drop by the Zoom, but it's just in a very brief window. So we're going to hear more from the New York team on the next panel, but I just wanted to give him a moment to say hello, since this is one of the pleasures and benefits of the Zoom world that we're in.
Absolutely, Madam Chair. Go ahead.
Thank you so much. Jermaine, welcome. I'm Kenzie Bach. I'm the Vice Chair of the committee chairing today's hearing, and you have the floor.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity. I'm very excited that you're even working on this issue. So peace and blessings to everyone. Love and light to everyone. Thank you for having me again. As was mentioned, my name is Jamani Williams. I'm the public advocate for New York City. I happen to be right now the second highest ranking official in the city. And I've been in my career, I've been a tenant organizer. I was proud when I became the housing chair of the city council, and now I'm the public advocate of the city of New York. I'm using my voice and my office to amplify those of tenants who continue to suffer because of the worst landlords in our city. Among my office's duties is creating the annual worst landlord watch list. It analyzes and identifies the buildings and landlords with the most egregious unaddressed violations. As we looking at the data and looking at the buildings and speaking with tenants, we've seen the real human costs of landlord negligence. We've seen very dangerous conditions, chronic condition of mold, rodents, electrical problems, lack of heat or hot water, sometimes lack of water. And we've seen who the worst perpetrators are often too regularly. The list has been an invaluable tool for tenants and for the city. It helps New Yorkers stay away from the worst actors. It helps the city to continue to hold them accountable. It helps us to create new legislation, and it definitely helps organizers as they organize buildings and communities across the city. I really hope our work can be a model for cities across the country. I'm very glad that Boston is exploring this tool that can help advocate housing justice. I know we're going to hear from John Catt from my office. Just want to make sure I give him a shout out. He's amazing. He is the brains behind the worst landlord watch list, especially on the tech side. He has an amazing way of making tech work for government and for the residents of cities that people live in. So I just want to shout him out, and I know you're going to hear great things from him. But thank you very much for giving me an opportunity.
Thank you so much, Giovanni. And yeah, I think housing justice, it's something that we can get over the New York, Boston parochialism and say is an urgent need in both cities. And so we're excited to learn from that model. And thank you for lending your team's time and talent to our hearing today as well.
Thank you so much. Peace, everyone.
Thank you. All right, Councillor Braden, back to you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So we had this ordinance, Ordinance 9(1)(3) identifies chronic offenders a point system to help identify chronic offenders and grade them according to the intensity of their offences. Has that been implemented yet, or is that still on the back burner?
Absolutely. So that's one of the pieces of the ordinance that's been a bit of a challenge to implement. Part of the issue is that that requires a certain amount of coordination between a number of city departments, because what's necessary is getting violation data from a number of departments and then getting that into the appropriate technology to be able to assess a scoring system. So that's actually a piece that remains one of the challenges that we hope to sort of prioritize and moves to the front of the list. But to be honest, that's one of the things that the department has not been able to accomplish at this point.
One thing to add to that is just the work that we alluded to earlier in terms of digitizing the reactive inspections is a foundational element of getting that chronic offender point system up and running. That's a major component of that point system, but we are making strides towards it, and it's certainly something that all of our work is layering up to.
And then just in terms of coordination among different departments, which other departments would you be working with? Would it be assessing and D&D, or what other departments would be part of that chain?
Code enforcement would be an important one. Probably the police department. Some of the chronic offender issues have to do with whether or not at a particular location, the police has to be called on a regular basis because of noise, partying, and so forth. So those are some of the things that we'd have to coordinate and incorporate into a point system.
Okay, that's good to know. Madam Chair, I'm very cognizant of the fact that we have other folks from other cities calling in to join our conversation, so that's all I have for now.
Great, thank you so much, Councillor Braden. Councillor Mejia?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. So just a few questions. I'm just curious, when we send out ISD to inspect a unit, can you just talk to me a little bit about how we're also coordinating with other city departments and services? So for example, if we go to an apartment that is occupied by an immigrant family and the inspector finds that the apartment is unlivable, how do we connect that family to MOIA or OHS? Like what kind of process do we have in place to connect people to whatever supports they may need in terms of city services to help facilitate the situation? And then I'm just curious, I'm the dashboard queen, so I always want to know what's up with these dashboards. Do we have a list of landlords who are consistently non-compliant? Because I think that information is helpful. And then we've heard a lot from a number of residents from the Mildred Haley and the conditions there that are absolutely unacceptable. Rust, rats, broken windows, and so much more. And we have also heard that there is a deferred maintenance backlog worth over $50 million. So I'm just curious, how are we coordinating with BHA to hold them accountable to the low-income residents of the Mildred Haley?
I think to your first question, as Dion alluded to earlier, we have a task force group here that responds to our most serious situations that require coordination across departments. And so for situations that are complicated, that's beyond simple inspection, we don't simply send out a housing inspector, but that team will respond, and that'll include the police department. It will include our building department. It'll include our housing inspector, sort of a cross-functional group of folks who not just go in and inspect the place, but try to assess what the issues are and figure out what the appropriate solutions should be, and who and what other appropriate departments should be contacted. As you can imagine, a group like that doesn't operate in sort of a cookie cutter fashion, because what we found was these situations aren't cookie cutter. They're complicated, and basically we need a cross-functional group of folks to go in, assess the situation, then figure out what are the most appropriate resources to sort of bring to bear. So we do have that team. That's a team that's in place, and whenever a complicated situation comes up, they're the ones that we send out. We don't simply send out a housing inspector.
Yeah. So could I just I got half of the answer to the question, but what I'm asking is what happens to the people in these units? We understand that there's going to be changes made involving the police when it comes to the structure itself, but I'm just curious about the people. Like, I'm just curious about what infrastructure is in place to help support these families.
Well, again, best we can make referrals. There are certain cases where we will specifically note to landlords it's their requirement perhaps to put people up in other temporary situations like hotels, for instance, while repairs are being made. So that happens, but we certainly make as many of the referrals as possible to make sure that people are taken care of.
Commissioner Leiden, I see your hand is up. Please feel free to jump in.
Thank you very much, Chairperson Bach. Good afternoon. Good morning, everybody. Good morning, councilors. Good morning, fellow co-workers. If I might just add on to Assistant Commissioner Williams, it depends, Councilor Mejia, on the situation itself, the particular situation. If it is an unsafe, any of those individuals' lives are in any danger whatsoever, be it building code, housing code, through electrical shortcomings, mechanical shortcomings, that unit will be vacated. And it will be at the expense of the individual who rented it out to them. Ultimately, it has to be vacated. Our concern first and foremost is at the safety of the individuals within that unit. And I would just like to add that in there, please. And thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I just kind of want to underscore that we've heard from many constituents who were experiencing issues around living in unsafe conditions. And I'm not going to add any additional layers to the complexity of this conversation, but there are folks who then feel once they have filed a complaint, then there's some retaliation that happens to some of these folks who are living in these spaces. So I just think that there's definitely a lot of stuff that we need to do on the city front to ensure that people who are reporting these landlords feel safe in doing so, because there is a history of, or it seems to be a history, allegedly. I'm not going to say I can't confirm nor deny because I'm not there to witness it, but that people have felt targeted and by the landlords just because they have filed a complaint. So I just want to name that as something that we need to just keep in the back of our minds as we continue. But I did have two other questions, and I want to be mindful of the time, and would like to at least get to my two other questions. Thank you.
Thanks. Can I jump in on this? So I appreciate that point, Councilman here. It's 100% accurate. That's one of the reasons why we did not want to solely have a reactive complaint-driven system, because some tenants, do unfortunately get retaliation, and that's why we have an Office of Housing Stability to help address any occurrences of that. And that's why it's so important that we have a proactive approach that doesn't rely on the tenant to file a complaint. It just has the inspection is due to the city selecting that unit. I also want to touch quickly on the comment about the Mildred Haley building, that Boston Housing Authority development. We are working with the BHA. We hold them to the same standards as any other landlord. I know they're working very hard to address issues in that development that needs serious investment. Some of it is very complex. Some of this is due to lack of federal funding, to be honest with you. But the Housing Authority has been very creative in finding ways to finance investments that are needed across their portfolio. And this is one of those parts of their portfolio that needs attention, and they are responding whenever we bring things to their attention and addressing issues.
Okay. Mildred Haley is going to be one of those situations that I'm going to be closely monitoring, because it's just horrific that people are subjected to live under those conditions. But and then I'm just trying to keep track of my time and also mindful of other folks that need to speak. I'm curious if there was any questions around I'm curious about why are owner-occupied properties with 6 or fewer units exempt from inspection requirements? Can you just give me some insight as to why that is?
That was the final outcome of the ordinance that was passed, and actually that was part of the revision of the ordinance in 2014.
Okay, so I wasn't there. I don't know how that came to be, but I'm just wondering in practice and implementation, how has that panned out? These exemptions, have you seen more? Well, and if they're exempt, then how do we know what's happening within those spaces?
But we still conduct inspections in all types of dwellings In those type of dwellings, it's typically through the occupant asking us for an inspection, or often it's if there's Section 8 involved and there's an inspection through that mechanism. But those units that are exempt are not subject to being selected for our periodic inspection program at this time.
Okay, Chief, thank you, Chief. I have been notified that my time is up, and so I'm not going to hold anyone else hostage. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Councilor Mejia. And in deference to our next panel, I'm going to forgo my questions. I'll just say that I think the ISD team is doing, an amazing job. I think it's great to be shifting more from the reactive to the proactive inspections. I think that the real challenge that we face and where we're looking to learn from the next panel is that, it's not a small detail that we've got a lot of these records still on paper and that we aren't able to pull together that scorecard and list, because the reality is that we all know that what you guys can achieve through inspections, proactive and reactive, there's another scale of magnitude of what we can achieve through people being afraid about the reputational hazard of being on a list and having, the records accessible to the public about what kind of a landlord they are. And no number of inspections is necessarily going to compensate for, that's the whole idea behind the ordinance is to really make that kind of scrutiny possible. And then obviously, also being able to pull all those threads together would help us, I think, on the kind of fines and focused attention front. And I know those are things that these other cities have done some great work on. And so looking forward to hear that. But I just want to say that's my focus on that is not a denigration of the incredible work that the inspectors do out there in the field. It's more like we can't go to 100,000 inspections a year, right? So it's like, what are the shortcuts to getting people to shape up? And I think one of them really is publicity and that focused attention that we can get through systems. So that's definitely kind of where my headspace on this is. But thank you so much to the IST team, both for speaking today and for all the work you do on this. I want to go, actually, I'll give Chief, if you wanted to say anything, or Commissioner Leiden before I jump to the next panel.
Commissioner, you want to go?
Sure. Thank you, Chairperson. Basically, I agree but the public record is there because the violations are public record. This is now in the transitional phase to the digitized and the automated system that we can achieve. The resources, the information is there for the public to access, even be it on paper in our database, in our current database. Obviously, much more labor intensive to get to that point, but we do have resources available. Somebody can check out particular properties and particular owners.
I appreciate that. And I think, Commissioner, that what we all find as counselors is, once you've got a bad actor, you can chase the paper trail on them. But I think when we think about the information asymmetry that renters face and kind of the number of folks who don't know how to navigate the space and are naive about how to check in on what the landlord they're renting from, what their track record is, I think that's where this kind of stuff, the ease of access to the public, really matters a lot.
Agreed.
Great. And Chief, you all set?
Yes, I'm all set. Thank you again for the opportunity. We look forward to hearing from our colleagues in New York.
Great. Thank you so much. I am jumping over now to our panel from our sister cities. I'm not sure they all have that official designation, but we're really thrilled to have them here with us today. And I'll try to do some introductions. So first off, we've got John Catt, who was introduced a little bit by Jemane Williams, but he is the Director of Technology Development and Data from the Office of the Public Advocate in New York City. And he sort of oversees their whole technology operations and hopefully can speak a little bit to some of what we were just talking about. We've got Grant Ulrich, who's the Managing Deputy Commissioner from Chicago's Department of Buildings, who's responsible for code development, policy, and administration, and is leading a multi-year effort to better align their construction requirements. So thank you, Grant, for being here. And then also, I think we've got our colleague from north of the border, Toronto, Brad Bradford. He is the city councillor there from Ward 19, elected in 2018, one of the youngest members of the council. I am the youngest member of the Boston Council, so solidarity there. And currently serves as the vice chair of Toronto's Budget Committee, a board member of the Toronto Transit Commission, and a member of Toronto's Planning and Housing Committee, as well as their representative for the Federation of Canadian Municipalities. And I think has a planning background. And Toronto has a great model program, Rent Safe TO, and we're really grateful to him for being able to join us today. I lived in Britain for a few years, so I recognize the poppy. That's not one of our traditions here, but you know, it's a good thing for Remembrance Week. So thank you to all three groups for being here. And I think what we'll do is just go through some, just if you can give a little bit of an opening statement about what this kind of kindred program and work looks like in your municipality, that would be great. And then throw it up open to questions. And in deference to my elected colleague, I'll actually go in reverse order. So I'm just going to start with Councillor Bradford from Toronto.
Well, thanks very much. And it's really nice to be here. So thanks to you, Councillor Bach and Councillor Edwards and Braden. And congratulations, of course, on everyone for being reelected and the big historic election for your new mayor. That's very exciting. We've been watching here. You know, again, my name is Brad Bradford, and I'm the councillor in Beaches, East York, up here in Toronto. And we represent each of our wards is about 120,000 folks. The city is pushing up against 3 million, so we continue to grow. We've got lots of construction and development underway. Historically, it's been a lot of condominiums, but we are making a push for more and more rental development, which is why these sorts of programs are really important. And I will add to that, I spent a few years in the lovely city of Boston myself. I was living down on Gartland Street in Jamaica Plain. So it is actually really special to be on the line talking about housing and rental apartments with everyone today. So I will talk for 2 or 3 minutes just to share Toronto's experience. As you said, Councillor Bach, our program is called Rent Safe TO. We put the TO bookend on basically everything we do, just so people know it refers to Toronto, but I can dispense with that here. And I understand today, I've been listening to the committee here. We're looking at the City of Boston's code 9-1.3 and 9-1.4. And so these are, my understanding, inspection and reinspection of rental units and the rental dwelling unit delivery standards. So those, my read on this is that the codes have very important foundational provisions for requiring rental units to be registered, setting the minimum standards for inspections and all of those other measures. And that's actually very similar to what Toronto had in place through our multi-residential apartment buildings program and all of the associated bylaws prior to Rent Safe coming in for us in 2017. A little bit about Rent Safe. You know, foundationally, first and foremost, it's about protecting tenants' rights to safe and adequate housing. The program does it in two key ways. First is sort of smart, well-designed regulation rooted in proactive enforcement. And then really the key to the program's success is just a ton of accountability and transparency in reporting the outcomes of our inspection regime. So the inspection and reporting regime of Rent Safe applies to all apartment buildings with 3 or more stories and 10 or more units. In other words, in the Toronto context, that's about 30% of Toronto's residents who live in approximately 3,500 apartment buildings that are in fact covered by this program. It applies to all private, not-for-profit, and public landlords alike. And under the program, buildings are assessed at a minimum of every 3 years. There's 20 different categories for assessment. Each category is graded on a scale of 1 to 5, and then the building has an overall score of 100. So that's the math on that. Assessment categories cover everything from amenities and common areas, elevators, building exteriors, exterior grounds, lighting, security, overall cleanliness, there's a review of the mandatory plans like a cleaning plan, electrical maintenance, state of good repair, capital plans, emergency services plans. And then there's also a review of mandatory processes. So having a formal tenant service request process, what does that look like? Having a process for notifying your tenants about the results of the review and the communication on that. Based on a building's assessment score, our enforcement staff will go out within a specified time period for another evaluation. So, if you're scoring 81 to 100, the building will get its next evaluation in 3 years, where if you're in the 51 to 65 range, you're getting evaluated within a year. Any building that scores below 50%, they have to go through a full audit almost immediately. I think one thing important to note from the inspections and governance standpoint is our city's rental apartment bylaw is where the rent safe requirements are housed. And it really acts like an umbrella across several other bylaws, which gives the authority to assess buildings for a range of issues. Anything related to property management bylaw, our adequate heat bylaw, waste bylaw, pest control, lawn grass and weeds bylaw, fence and graffiti, and zoning bylaws. So for issues like amenities that are required through our zoning. So taking this approach really allows RentSafe to provide sort of a full 360-degree look at the building. And the process is really about incentivizing the small but impactful minority of landlords who need a bit of a kick in the right direction to get their house in order. So what we're doing by having RentSafe as a program, it's about leveraging the communication and public accountability of the program. That is really the core principle. And I think your staff are always thinking about how to sort of bring these components in. But the thing I want to touch on in terms of the most important element of RentSafe is really that communication and accountability. So all of the results of the assessments are available to tenants and members of the public. And that is key. The city's website has an interactive map of all the buildings in the program. You can look up the address of any of these 3,500 buildings and find their scores. And so the program is requiring that all buildings have a notice board in the lobby that prescribes several things. The evaluation results have to be posted for tenants to see. Information on how to make complaints and report non-compliance has to be available. They have to post notice of any violations that have been issued, and other key plans like the pest management plan. All that stuff needs to be posted. And again, hearing some of your colleagues' comments, it's really about making it easy for prospective tenants or existing tenants to access that information, know what they're getting into. Landlords also have to provide rent-safe information to a tenant whenever they sign a lease. So again, if you're coming in, you're looking at a prospective apartment, they have to provide you with their scores. And again, it goes back to the transparency and the accountability. It also has to be distributed to all the tenants in the building on an annual basis, so you know where that building is at. And I think the impact of this sort of public accountability, what we've seen is that it's improving the standards of these buildings, and we're getting some traction on that fairly quickly. The first year alone, average scores for buildings went up by 12%. So we're 3 years in now. The city laid charges in 338 cases, and 194 resulted in convictions. So, that's actually not really a good news story in terms of the state of affairs in some of our buildings, but it does point out that the accountability is critical, and we are seeing improvement. From a public standpoint, from a political standpoint, I'll flag one of the challenges that we've had here in Toronto. We're really trying to find the right balance for holding landlords to account and not stigmatizing tenants. There's been a push for sort of a public health approach, a traffic light, red, amber, green system that you would have up front at the front end of the building. The city, our colleagues, our council has decided not to go that route because of the potential stigma. You live in a red building, you live in a bad building. There are different views on that. And I would say even in the sort of tenant and housing advocacy space, we actually heard a wide range of views and perspectives. Some people were very for that. They think it'll deliver better accountability. Other folks are like, I don't want to go home to a red building every day. With that respect to the public system of a traffic light approach. But it's a conversation that's going on, and I think that we still need to find the right balance to strike. So the last message is 360 approach to any kind of inspection and enforcement is really, really critical so that you don't end up getting in silos, all the different divisions we have and the bureaucracy we have here in Toronto. That's always a challenge. So Rent Safe sort of breaks that down. And the second is to make that commitment to the public accountability for landlords. They need to know that they're going to be held accountable. They need to know that this information is going to be shared with existing tenants and future tenants, and that we live in a world of public ratings. We all have the opportunity to seek out thousands of reviews before purchasing anything, even something as basic as a toothbrush. So I think we have to ask why governments would not be providing residents with that level of information so they can make fully informed decisions on their housing choices or take action to improve the existing conditions. So that's kind of the lay of the land up here in Toronto, and happy to take any questions from the panel.
Great. Thank you so much, Councillor Bradford. And I have many questions. We'll go next to Chicago and then John, and maybe and have two questions all in conversation. So Grant, I don't know if you've had Room Raider, but it's an amazing background you've got there. Thank you so much for joining us all the way from Chicago.
Good morning. I'm Grant Ulrich. I'm Managing Deputy Commissioner in the City of Chicago Department of Buildings, and this is my real office. This is a real background. Thank you for inviting me to the City of Chicago and the City of Chicago to present to you today on this important topic. So the Chicago Department of Buildings enhances safety and quality of life for Chicago's residents and visitors through permitting, inspections, trade licensing, and enforcement of the Chicago construction codes, which include our property maintenance requirements, which are known as the Chicago minimum requirements for existing buildings. I was asked to speak today specifically about Chicago's building code scofflaw ordinance and enhancements to that ordinance, which were proposed by Mayor Lori Lightfoot and adopted by our city council earlier this year in cooperation with our department and a number of other departments. So the building code scofflaw ordinance is an important tool among the several strategies which we use in Chicago to address building code violations and specifically housing with chronic or recurring violations. Every year, the Department of Buildings refers about 2,000 to 3,000 buildings with serious code violations to our law department to initiate code enforcement proceedings in our circuit court. And the bulk of those are residential buildings. We also have a sort of lesser administrative enforcement program. Again, if there are serious violations, we take it through our circuit court process, which has additional due process, but it can slow the process down sometimes when we're going in front of full court judges. So for most building owners, the circuit court enforcement process does spur action to address the violations and achieve compliance. And again, compliance is our ultimate goal. Sometimes code enforcement programs are tried to use for revenue or other things. I heard from my colleagues in Boston, again, compliance is our ultimate goal. This is about safety. So we may generate fines, but fines are not our ultimate goal, and our programs are not revenue centers. If we can get compliance, we want owners to put that money back into the buildings and not give it to the city where it goes into the corporate fund and goes all sorts of other places. So a handful of owners, however, do not take the enforcement process seriously, and it doesn't get their attention. So for these buildings, the scofflaw ordinance provides additional pressure to compel compliance and also prevents the owners of these buildings, which are designated as scofflaws, from receiving city incentives or discretionary entitlements, such as permits to build new buildings. They can get permits to fix the conditions that are creating the problems, but we want to prevent them from building new buildings or doing other improvements while they still have open violations, getting or renewing certain city business licenses. Specifically, one of the big pressure points is licenses for short-term rentals, things like Airbnb, preventing them from purchasing city land, winning city contracts, or getting other city financial incentives while they're in the scofflaw designation. As part of the 2021 reform, so we've had a version of scofflaw for a little over a decade in Chicago, but we did take the opportunity in 2020 and pass reforms in 2021 to look at it and see how we can make it better. We streamlined the criteria for being placed on the scofflaw list. Before, we had many of the challenges that I think I heard Boston has in terms of coming up with a point system and then actually applying that fairly with different data systems. We have a lot of computerized data, but it was not in a form that easily could be converted into points, and it still required a lot of sort of human collating across systems to get a fair list. Also, our previous ordinance did not require that that list be issued on any kind of cadence. So the reforms require that the list be updated every 6 months. Again, that's made possible by streamlining some of the criteria. And then again, we previously had the list available in various forms on the internet, a recommitment to making that available through the city's data portal. But we understand that we need to do more than just put it on a website, a dashboard, or a data portal. Again, for the most vulnerable renters in our community conversations with advocates and others, again, they don't have access to that, or they don't have the time or the resources to navigate through city websites to find that. So we try to work with our Department of Housing and other community partners to disseminate that information so it does get out there to organizers, to tenants, because we really need to work in partnership to have that information be meaningful. So under the reforms, an occupied residential building, which still has serious violations that are unresolved more than 18 months after the first court date, is designated as a building with serious and chronic violations, and the owner of that building is designated as a scofflaw. Buildings that are tracked through the scofflaw program are subject to enhanced inspections, so they're going to have regular inspections as part of the ongoing court enforcement case. And then also the ordinance requires follow-up inspections for at least a year to ensure that the violations don't recur, because that is something that we've seen where we have a building, they make enough fixes to get out of court, but it is a problem landlord, and they let that building deteriorate again, and it's back in court in a few years. So we try to focus on that. We also have a disclosure requirement. So again, focusing on these most problematic buildings where we're having our law department work with those owners to have them disclose all of the other properties that they own. So we can go on and look at those properties and make sure that there are properties that are not on our radar. So happy to talk about other programs that we have to work with tenants. I was specifically asked to talk about scofflaw and happy to answer any questions that you have. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Grant. Really appreciate that. Next up, John Catt from New York.
Good morning, all, and thank you for having me. My name is John Catt. I'm the Director of Technology, Development, and Data here at the New York City Office of the Public Advocate. And as the Public Advocate said a little bit earlier, our landlord watch list is an annual initiative that the Public Advocate's Office has been doing for over a decade now, using open data, using interagency information, and relying heavily on the robust advocacy organizations here in New York City. We're able to craft this list that is driven by data to hold and showcase the worst acting landlords here in New York City to account. And that has had a varying effect throughout New York City, whether it's through legislation, whether it's through giving tenants the information in a discernible and actionable way, whether it's getting different organizations and advocacy groups the ability and foundation to be able to organize effectively and have the information, be equipped with the information to hold their landlords accountable. This list has really evolved over the years to serve those differing needs. This list is based off of housing maintenance code violations here in New York City. Housing maintenance code violations are from our Housing Preservation and Development Agency. They rank A, B, C, and I. A and B and C. C is the worst hazard violation. A is the least. And we rank these landlords in a scoring mechanism of those differing, varying hazardous levels and per unit in their buildings, compiling this list of landlords based on the number of buildings that meet that selection criteria. We call this the watch list selection criteria. And this is, again, using open data that I'm going to refer to a lot here because I think from what I've heard from the conversation so far, we're very blessed here in New York City to have a robust open data law that requires these agencies like our housing agency, like our Department of Building, like our finance agency to publicize in a discernible, transparent, and regular fashion data that's now used by entities like ourselves, the Public Advocate's Office, who is here to hold them to account, but also for any constituent that would like to engage and utilize that data. And so the list is in a web form right now, but every year we do a launch in the month of December based on 12 months of data that is not only to showcase the new top 100 landlords on our list, but also to equip those entities here in the city, whether it's city council or the agencies tasked with enforcing these violations, on our update of where these landlords have been in acting in their building in the past year. And so that is at its core an information sharing tool, and also a shame mechanism that over the years has really prompted landlords who might have been the worst landlord ranked number 2 now not even on the list, and at least following the tenant maintenance code or the maintenance code book that require them to keep their buildings in a certain condition here in New York City. The list also allows entities such as banks, which have recently now started using this list to engage in their lending practices, whether it's current portfolios or new applications, to better understand how landlords have maintained buildings and interacted with tenants through our complaint mechanism, to understand that, like was mentioned, they might try to just get violations off the book on a surface level, but really not changing the underlying practices that got their buildings and their portfolio in the condition that warranted inclusion on the worst landlord watch list. So the list is compiled using just a ranking of the housing maintenance code violations, which have to deal with things like the public advocate mentioned, mold, heat, hot water, regular conditions in buildings. But we are now also including in an informational base things like taking tenants to housing court, eviction processes, tax liens on buildings, violations against the Department of Building, whether it's working permit, construction methodologies, applications for changing in buildings, because we have found correlation between landlords who are flouting the housing maintenance code, who they're also very likely to utilize evictions as a form of harassment on tenants. They're very likely to have tax liens on their buildings because they're not up to where they need to be in taxes, whether it's through water charges or just regular property taxes. And they're also very likely to use housing court as another way to harass tenants, not only through evictions, but of attempting to remove tenants that they might not be able to get what is deemed market rate for certain apartments. And so this collection of open data on the Landlord Watch List website has really painted a well-rounded picture of how egregiously these landlords are treating tenants. And just for a bit of context, in New York City right now, we have around 2.6 million open violations against the housing maintenance code across our 300,000 plus residential buildings. And on average, there's 0.2 C, most hazardous violations open per unit in a regular building in New York City. Buildings that meet the watch list criteria usually have around 2.5 most hazardous C violations per unit in their building. So there's really, whatever that is, 10 times or whatever, the amount of the most hazardous violations, things like not having heat in the winter or not certifying lead corrections. So we've seen through the data, this is now my 7th year running this watch list, we've seen this continued abuse of the maintenance code and by virtue, the tenants who are living in these units by these landlords. And just the shame at the very surface level has produced results in bringing these landlords to the table. So landlords are now coming to our office, coming and working with the city entities that manage the different maintenance codes to figure out how to get them off of the list. And step number one is correcting these violations in the building. So that would be a really brief overview of this list and some of its impacts down the chain. But I would say, again, pointing to data here being open and transparent is kind of the bedrock and foundation of anything here. Being able to have that not only as an office, but for our constituency has really allowed tools like this to prompt change to hold these landlords more accountable.
Great. Thank you so much, John. Really thanks to all three of you. This is exciting stuff. Councillor Braden, you have the floor for questions first.
You know, our folks in Boston said that the major barrier to implementation of chronic offenders point system is about tracking an owner's entire portfolio. That's one of the challenges we have here. How do you folks in Chicago and New York deal with this challenge?
Yeah, I think, again, that's going to be a challenge across the board. Before I came to the Department of Buildings, I was a prosecutor in the city's law department. Again, there's going to be different legal structures in different states, but here it's very common. Each building is owned in a separate LLC, and there really isn't a disclosure requirement. So again, it's going to be understanding if there's shared maintenance companies, shared management companies, and we work, both with our records, but we work with community partners to identify those things. We also find that I think, like the public advocate in New York said, you can track other data points. So sometimes our bad owners are all using the same, often bad contractors. So sometimes we can trace those threads, but it is a challenge, I think, regardless of the quality of the data system you have.
Okay, thank you. What about New York?
Yeah, this is a really interesting problem that I would say we have not fully solved, but there are different avenues that we've had to take to identify who's really responsible at the end of the day for a given building. Right now in New York City, we have, if you own a certain type of building, which is per unit guided, you have to register certain pieces of information every year about who's responsible for what. Things like managing agent, the management company responsible for fixing issues in the buildings, but also things deemed head officer or individual owner. And so by virtue of owning a building like that, you are now forced to put names on paper who you deem head officer or individual owner for a given building. However, landlords are not always putting the exact person for that entity in those fields. And that's a data problem. That's also a legal problem, a law problem. There needs to be more enforcement as to what information can be put into those fields. But roughly, the head officer and individual owner is the best bet on who owns said building. Many times, as Grant was mentioning, they're also putting their lawyers in there sometimes, they're putting representations of the LLC in there sometimes. So we've combined that with listing out the LLCs, the corporations and entities that are also responsible for given buildings. And that's much harder to feign and put, a blanket response to, because there are legal implications for tax purposes and accountability purposes. So by combining two things around who they're saying owns a building, the corporate entity, if there is one, and then also we do some pretty hard work in scraping deeds, we're doing kind of this three-tiered approach to identifying who a landlord might be. But at the end of the day, whatever name is there, when they make it onto the list, if it is the wrong person, that is fixable. But if it's the person that doesn't think, has been put there by the real landlord of the company, they're still upset, and then they end up correcting that problem. So at the end of the day, we are really able to get to the end person who owns the building by just publicizing whatever the open data has said at that point.
Thank you. And then in terms of, your watch list, what sort of penalties do your landlords face in New York City? Like, what are the consequences apart from shaming?
So right now, there is no direct implication in terms of fines, in terms of what they can do in the city. What ends up, shame is the number one, but what has produced from the list, just by virtue of the list being put out every year and made better every year through more open data, has city entities that are in charge of enforcement are now using this list to pay closer attention to these landlords. So they are separated out from all other acting landlords for attention by the Housing Preservation and Development to ensure that those landlords are not, skirting their system of enforcement. But we've also, through legislation and through the data that we've combed through over the past 7 or so years, have been able to introduce more strict legislation on, especially around these C violations, how long these violations can go unaddressed, the fines levied against those violations, and more importantly, self-certification. So not sure if Boston has this form of apparatus for landlords and their violations, but in New York City, a landlord can self-certify many times that a violation has been corrected. We're really pushing for an inclusion of this list that no longer be the case, and that once you have been deemed a landlord on this watch list, you really now can only remove a violation if the city has deemed it removed. So that would be kind of the surface level implications. But as I mentioned in my opening, banks have also contacted our office. So when we start, we have produced a worst banks list in the past that is tied to the watch list, where we've again done the hard work of going in and collecting and coalescing all of the lenders who are routinely giving money to these worst acting landlords, even though they make it on the list. And now these lenders are paying closer attention to who's on this list and making, including that in their decision-making process to lend money. So the consequences are definitely felt by the landlords, and it is shown by the amount of them that contact me and this office to get off the list.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Thank you, Madam Chair. That's all I have for now.
Great. Thank you so much, Councillor Braden. All right, Councillor Mejia, and then me, and I'm mindful, I know Councillor Bradford has to go at 11:45, so Councillor Mejia, and then I do want to get in a question on Toronto before he has to go.
So Councillor Bach, you'll be happy to hear that I don't have any questions, but I just wanted to thank our colleagues from across the country who are helping us address this issue here locally. So thank you so much for everything that you have shared. And I think that there are a lot of really great lessons that we can learn here in terms of more specifically around the accountability and transparency piece, because, shaming people to death isn't really going to fix the problem. I think that the best way for us to really address it is to really hit them with their pockets hurt. And I think that there needs to be some of those consequences that are attached to it. So appreciate everyone's insight and guidance, and I'm looking forward to the next steps. And that is it. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Councillor Mejia. So Councillor Bradford, I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to, I noticed that you guys have a cutoff here, right, of 3 stories and 10 units. And I know Councillor Mejia was asking earlier about unit cutoffs, and I think generally with these things politically, part of the trade-off is smaller. If you get rid of the smaller things, you're not dealing as much with the small landlords who often don't want to deal with the burdensomeness or perceived burdensomeness of the new ordinance. But then, of course, that can be a lot of housing stock. So I'm just sort of curious how much you felt like you guys are capturing the main things that need to be an area of focus with those cutoffs.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think probably first and foremost, it just comes down to scale. The sheer number of buildings and other cities would face these challenges too. All of our other bylaws do, of course, still apply to the smaller buildings. So they are covered by that. And when I was talking about the rent safe program, it's really sort of that umbrella where it's tying all of those different bylaw requirements together under one program. So all of the buildings are still subject to those bylaw requirements, but rent safe is really about being proactive. So like you have 311, there is still that reactive channel where folks can go and make complaints through 311. And then of course, MLS, our municipal licensing and standards and buildings, will come out and do enforcement or inspections. It's about 20% of the rental units that are not covered by rent safe. So that's not insignificant. We have a bunch of different types of housing, secondary suites, basement apartments, laneway suites, duplexes, triplexes, not dissimilar from the housing stock that you, of course, would see in Boston. So that stuff wouldn't be there. But, you know, again, in listening to some of John's comments, like these big sort of institutional landlords that own, you know, dozens of buildings across the city, those are the ones that the program has been focused and structured around. And I think it just comes down to volume and scale, and you had to draw the line somewhere. Would be good to do more, of course.
No, of course. And I guess on that in that context of it's always good to do more. I mean, what did the staffing and resources in Fusion look like for you guys in terms of adding rent safe in? Because that's always I mean, that's obviously a constraint on everything we do as city government.
Yeah, it's you know, the budget for the program, it's a little challenging to tease out because we do that 360 degrees of enforcement. It's part of our sort of broader departmental budget for bylaw design and enforcement departments. So that's the municipal licensing and standards. To give folks in Boston a bit of context, I would say it's a fairly lean program on the operations side of our municipal licensing and standards department where they're running it. So there's one manager who's responsible for rent safe, and then a number of supervisors that coordinate across the enforcement teams to deliver the program. But again, it's a program that exists and sort of ties together all the different enforcement of our bylaws that we do under the rent safe banner. So we do have the enforcement resources that are there through our municipal licensing and standards team that does bylaw enforcement all the time. It's really the communications and the public accountability piece of rent safe that ties all of those things together. I think early on when the program was being developed, our policy and program staff, really worked hard to sort of design and roll out the program. But once it's up and running, not too dissimilar from the apartment regulations activity that we've already had in place, it really reflects and mirrors that and ties it all together for the communication and accountability. This was an effort in Toronto to modernize and organize and better communicate from government existing programs. So there is a landlord fee that we do at cost recovery, and that's a little over $11 per residential unit. I think the hardest part for us was just building the program and getting it off the ground.
Got it. And in terms of like that publicity and then how renters have reacted, I mean, do you have, it was raised by Councilor Mejia and others, I mean, right, like, do you have renters who are still, I assume you do, like afraid to reach out, because of the power dynamic with their landlords? How have you kind of tackled the language access challenges? I mean, what do you guys see in terms of the success with tenants really feeling empowered to speak up because of this?
Yeah, just very briefly, I think it's that transparency. So you know where the building is today, the history of the building, you have a sense of who the problematic landlords are, and because that's provided right when you're signing on the lease, it's and they're required to do that, or when you're renewing your lease, there is that accountability mechanism. We have predatory landlords in Toronto, to be sure, absolutely. In our instance, N12s, N13s, we do evictions, rent evictions, where they would be up, saying that they're upgrading an apartment to raise the rent and force people out. So we have to deal with all of that sort of stuff as well, like every city out there. And we do have predatory landlord practices. This I should add, actually, we do have financial fines that go out when we do orders and issue orders on all of this stuff. So there is accountability through fines and prosecution, as I made note in the early remarks. That is an incentive, I think, for people to clean up their act. But we're also in a market when it comes to rental housing in Toronto where, pre-pandemic we had less than 1% rental vacancy. So it's good to have the accountability and the transparency on these buildings so you know what the state of affairs and get a sense of what the property management is going to be like. But folks are, we're dealing with a housing crisis like a lot of cities across the continent. And, the landlord still has the upper hand when it comes to that space because we just don't have enough rental stock in Toronto. So that is for sure the challenge.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's a huge source of the power imbalance here. Grant, can I ask you, I'm really intrigued by the sort of idea that when people end up on the real scofflaw list that you're able to prevent them from sort of doing other discretionary business with the city. And that's definitely been something that I think we have a lot of interest in here because it feels sort of crazy when you're giving a building permit to somebody who you're constantly dealing with on the other end with the housing that they already own. I know, though, that there have been concerns in the past about sort of like how legitimately and legally we can tether the one thing to the other. Since, right, usually like with permits, there's a set of presumptions that are already kind of baked in about what's supposed to be considered. And I'm just curious how you guys navigated that legally and whether it's withstood challenge and kind of, just that piece of it.
Yeah, so I think the core of the program started again more than a decade ago before I was involved. We had a number of, as we took some of our public housing and tried to spread that stock out with different Section 8 programs, and our public housing was moving into voucher-based programs. We had a number of landlords who both were not maintaining their buildings and were getting a number of incentives either from city government or our sister agencies, the Housing Authority or others. So that was the root of the program. We didn't want someone being a scofflaw problem landlord and then turning around and getting and it wasn't so much prohibiting the Section 8, but getting a city tax incentive to remodel a different building or to buy yet another building and add it to their portfolio. So that is where the program originated a decade ago. And then it was expanded over time to, again, wanting to make sure that they weren't getting, we had someone who I think kept from getting a contract to manage some public buildings when they already had a contract. They were mismanaging some housing buildings. So that's where it started. Again, we are able to sort of put some names on hold. It's not a perfect system, but we have withheld permits from people again when they're saying we have some landlords who own buildings in more advantaged neighborhoods and less advantaged neighborhoods, and they maybe have different standards for maintaining that housing stock. Again, we have used that to put pressure on them to not let certain buildings, if they have a problem building in one of our more disadvantaged neighborhoods, not letting them come in and build a brand new building in a more advantaged neighborhood. So we've done that once or twice. Again, a lot of it is the shame pressure. And I think the biggest pressure point that we've seen is those landlords wanting to get licenses for short-term housing, things like Airbnb, and putting the hold in that system, I think really did get a lot of people take it seriously. With our latest round of reforms, we went from our last list before the reforms having about 30 buildings and 30 owners on it. Our first list under the reforms has 98 buildings on it. So we're just seeing that sort of roll out. We've definitely are learning from this broadest round, but yes, the pressure is a mix of the shame and being on a public list, but also wanting to make sure that city government isn't saying naughty, naughty with one hand and then giving out an incentive with the other.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. And we, of course, it's always tricky, right? Because it's like with Airbnb, for instance, we have a very aggressive ordinance to try to basically minimize the amount of housing stock that's going that direction regardless, just because it's such an issue with us also with those really low vacancy rates. So it's always like, how do you, if you don't, some things you don't want to be an incentive, but I think there's lots that we could explore there. So thank you. I'm mindful, I know that Councillor Bradford has to go. So I just wanted to thank you so much for joining us, and say if there's ever anything that we do in Boston that's worth copying, happy to return the favor. So
lots of things to talk about in Boston. Great to see everyone. Best of luck going forward, and stay safe. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thanks, Brad.
And I just have one more question for John on the New York side. I mean, I guess if you could just speak to it. I mean, we have an open data portal in Boston. As Commissioner Leiden alluded to, there's still just categories of our data that are not there. And in some cases, it's stuff where, we've passed ordinances, we said it's going to happen, but it's just, as you probably know, like the implementation of tech transformation projects and the public procurement associated with them and whatever can really take a lot of time. So I'm sort of curious you said 7 years, right? Sort of what, if any, kind of big leaps forward have you seen? Like, is there something, is there a particular, like, knot you think you focused on, or that the city of New York is focused on, that's really kind of solved for some of this, or just any suggestions for really kind of pulling all those threads together into a robustly accessible data system? We're all using different systems, so it's not like you can say, oh, flip this back end switch or whatever, but just curious kind of what your thoughts would be on that.
Yeah, and it's not always been an amazing field over here in terms of how to access this data. So I have been working on it for 7 years now, and in the very early, the first 2 or 3 years, this data was not in the open data portal. So the open data portal was there, but this data was, a dump of a CSV file that we had to get access to every month or so to kind of comb through and create this list. But I think one key area that I've seen New York City do well in its early years of getting data on this portal and having it updatable, because a lot of data can be dumped and then it's stale. Like, the value of this data is that the housing maintenance code data is updated every day with updates from those inspectors and from the updates from the landlords. And so that is, to get to that system, we saw there had to be a lot of agencies involved, obviously, at that point, not just the Housing Maintenance Authority, but having the mayor has a Office of Data Analytics that is really tasked with kind of having these conversations interagency wide and kind of cutting through a lot of the competing interest of getting data to this portal, and taking some of the load off of that end agency, because the end agency is not only worried about the hygiene of the data and its update ability on an open data portal, they're worried about the inspectors on the field giving them good data to get into their own backend system. So having kind of this third party in the city who has an understanding, a robust understanding of data infrastructure, and then the ability from at least in a New York City structure, the mayor's office being able to designate the agency, work with the Office of Data, that proved a lot of fruit in being able to get a system from, to be honest, pretty old and antiquated database to an open data portal that's updated daily. So I think that has gone a long way, that Office of Data Analytics. And then even on our side, when we dealt with this data dump every month, there are other tactics that we were taking to verify this data, which I think is also important, because again, the end agency, it's not their number one concern, especially in an open data portal, to make sure that data is transparent and correct at all times. So having a mechanism within city government, which Public Advocate's Office serves very nicely here in New York City, to make sure that government is doing the right job in providing services as they're saying, we were able to, add a lot of feedback into that loop of going from raw data to usable data like the landlord watch list. So yeah, hopefully that was helpful. I think it's not going to be an easy task, but having a central entity within a city that's not even just tasked with getting data to be open, but making sure it's good data and usable data when it's open has really paid off in the long run.
Great, thank you so much. No, that's great to understand. And yeah, I think that's definitely something we should try to emulate. All right, I think those are my questions. I want to go back to Councillor Braden to see if she had any follow-ups before we go. And just, if you are a member of the public waiting to testify, as soon as this panel is done, I'll be going to public testimony, so you know. But Councillor Braden,
I think we've had a very comprehensive review of the challenges and the opportunities and to learn from the best practices of our colleagues in other cities. So this has been a very helpful conversation. I have no other questions at this time. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Great, thank you so much. And yeah, and I'll just say seriously to our colleagues, Grant and John, I just appreciate so much you coming. I know that talking to Boston for a couple of hours doesn't do anything to improve the situation in New York or Chicago. So it is a act of genuine intercity fellowship and friendship, and we appreciate it. And again, you know, if there's anything that we're doing up here where you guys want to be in touch with the department or with us on the council, just, you know, don't hesitate to reach out. We really want to be able to reciprocate however we can.
Thank you so much. And we have learned a lot from Boston as we rolled out ADU programs here in Chicago over the last year and a half as well. You've done a lot of great work there. So thank you.
Well, thanks.
Same. Thank you so much. It's been amazing. And the more cities that can do things around holding landlords accountable make our list stronger. So that really does help us out in the long run. So thank you.
Absolutely. No, and it always helps us if we can say, hey, listen, everyone's doing this. This is the new normal, everybody. Like, got to shape up. So yeah, no, we appreciate that kinship as well. All right, I think with that, we're concluding the panel. I will just give Councillor Braden, do you have any final words before I go to the public?
I really think this is an important first step to moving forward to establish some sort of registry of problem of landlords that are not keeping up their properties and providing adequate residential housing for our residents. Just because we have a housing squeeze, it doesn't mean that people should be forced to live in sanitary or substandard housing. So this is really a critically important issue. I look forward to perhaps moving this on to a working session where we can get into the nuts and bolts and come up with a plan to do something in Boston that will help address this very important issue. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you so much, Councillor Braden. And I should just read into the record a letter from Councillor Edwards, who cares quite a lot about this issue and unfortunately wasn't able to attend. Dear Committee on Housing and Community Development, I regret that I will be unable to attend the hearing on docket 1024, order for hearing to review rental unit condition standards and inspections in the city of Boston. I leave the committee in the capable hands of the vice chair of the committee and one of my co-sponsors, Councillor Bach. I'm confident it's been a productive and fruitful hearing. My staff has been attending, and I will thoroughly review the video, hearing minutes, and public testimony. Sincerely, Lydia Edwards, Boston City Councilor, District 1. So thank you, Councillor Edwards, for that. She definitely is a champion for renters and on this issue. So we appreciate her partnership, even though she wasn't able to make it today. And with that, I will now move over to public testimony. Carrie, I know I've had trouble moving folks over today, but if you could move over Joanna first and then Markeisha, that would be great. So we'll go first to Joanna Hines. Joanna, thank you for your patience. I know you've been on since the beginning of our hearing here, so appreciate you waiting, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and I'm glad I stayed on because I learned a lot, and it was really cool to hear and see people from different states and how they're trying to address this problem. So I'm going to keep it clear and concise because I'm very passionate about this and I want to be respectful of everyone's time. 3 sort of topic questions, and the first is, in Bunkerilla Housing, the largest public housing in New England, we're going through the process of a redevelopment. And I just want to speak to, first of all, thank you, Madam Chair, let me say that to start. I'm trying to get good with the formalities. I was listening to Councillor Mejia, am I saying it right? About what's happening in Mildred Haley, and it's really, it was sad to hear it, but it was also reaffirming because it's exactly what's happening here. And the biggest problem that I have with the intimidation and the feeling that many residents here in Charlestown have about, issuing kind of complaints or airing their concerns is that they are being bullied by the landlord. And in this case, the landlord is the BHA. So that's a big problem. This isn't just a landlord on a list that we need to keep our eye on. This is the Boston Housing Authority. And if you go on YouTube and click on Boston Housing Authority, you'll get 10 YouTubes of residents going into the office, being dismissed, videoing the whole thing with their kids, in tow. It's pretty terrible. But because this redevelopment is happening, I've been keeping up with it, and I've been reading everything and attending countless Zoom meetings. On January 14th, there was a minor modification to the plan, and it's a major modification because it changes the language from deeply affordable replacement units, which was what the people were promised, to replacement units from an income restricted list. So deeply affordable, in my understanding, is 30% AMI. Income restricted can be up to 60%. That's a very different demographic. As a person who lives in Charlestown, raising my family here, I like the fact that the neighborhood is diverse. I don't like the fact that the diversity is segregated into 27 acres, but I'm hopeful that when this redevelopment takes shape, that the diversity will not only stay, but expand. The people that live there today are, for the most part, they are in the 30% category. Half of those people have already left. Half of those people will likely not come back. So the demographic that we have there today is going to look, and I'm talking like look in terms of what the actual diversity looks like. It's going to look very white when the units are filled, because the list is going to be coming from a BHA list that includes people that make up to 80 grand a year. So I'm very concerned about that. And I'm sorry to hear that Councillor Edwards isn't here, because I've sent her numerous emails and she has not responded. I've called the BPDA. This is a big problem. We were promised 1,100 replaceable units and told that anyone who lives there today can come back. That may be true, but everyone that lives there today is not coming back. They're not all coming back. I know this. So what happens to the units that are left over? Are they going to go to people on the list that make 30 AMI, or are they going to go to people that make 60 AMI? We need to know this, because there's a difference, right? And I have the documents. I'm happy to send them to anyone who cares. But this isn't what I do for a living. I'm a yoga teacher with a wellness center and 3 kids. This has become a full-time job. I love it, but I don't have enough. I need help. I'm reading this stuff. I'm noticing things, and I need help. So if anyone on the council wants to have a conversation, I will provide you, or just answer my email. I'll provide you with all the things I'm finding that are worrisome to me. That's the first thing. Second thing is, as far as the current living conditions, people that are living there today are living in a blighted community. It's blighted. The rats, 5 to every squirrel. The dumpsters don't get taken care of. There's mold, there's asbestos, there's crumbling ceilings and broken windows. And all of these things have gotten worse since 2016. I looked at the HUD inspection reports. 2015, it was like at an 80. Things were looking good. 2016, they decided to do a little private development experiment, and it sunk 30 points. And I can show you that too, 30 points in 1 year. That feels like strategic blighting, in my opinion. Make the parcels so unlivable that people will take whatever you offer, even if it means being shoved into tall towers by the Tobin Bridge in exclusively segregated housing, which is what this deal is calling for. 3 buildings of all deeply affordable. This is 2021. So I'm wondering, how can we care for the people that are living there today and will stay there with their kids for 10 years while this thing takes shape? They can't wait. It has to come now. And so, last thing, I did write a letter back at Thanksgiving in 2020 saying, we need to have a budget. Inspectional services isn't getting it done. There needs to be more money from the developer toward the living conditions today. And so they threw $500,000 at the BHA to distribute at their discrepancy, or at their discretion. What that money is not, where's that money? Like, who's watching? It's just, I want to be of service, and I want to be a part of the problem solving as a civic activist. I just feel like it's hard. Thanks.
Thank you so much for your testimony, Joanna.
You're welcome.
And again, for being with us all day today. Next up is Markeisha. Markeisha.
Hi, I don't know if you guys can see me.
Yes, we can see you and we can hear you.
Okay, hi. Thanks everyone for this hearing. I appreciate the time taken to look into these things. And thank you, Joanna. I loved your testimony. So I'm just gonna get right into it. I wanted to know, so I hear a lot on the side of like how their landlords will be like they'll be beholden to like a higher power or whatever. So they're gonna be on that side of it. They're gonna be watched and put on lists and inside of computer systems and everything. But so I live in an apartment now, and this is not the first time. Like, I've had a bad landlord before. And the situation is this: what recourse do we have when the landlords know the inspectional services people, the ISD people, and the people who inspect from Boston Housing, when they come in and inspect and see everything and then still pass the unit? And so what recourse do I as a tenant have? Because I've had this happen before where I guess one of my landlords went into the bank foreclosure. The bank was in the process of taking the house, but they were still on the deed. They were still the landlord. And my water heater broke down and the furnace broke at the same time. And she didn't want to fix anything. I called inspectional services. They came in. Like, me and my kids were without hot water and heat for like weeks, months. And I had to go, she was going back. I found out later that she was going back and forth to court and getting it postponed. So I showed up at the courthouse. When I showed up at the courthouse, I saw the people that were inspecting my apartment sitting there with her, having conversation with her in the courtroom while me and my kids were in the cold. The only thing we had was the stove. The gas stove was the only thing working. And I heated hot water to heat the apartment and take baths and stuff. So that's one situation. And this situation that I'm in now, my ceiling has been flooded twice. I'm on the second floor. My ceiling has been flooded twice from whatever happened upstairs. I had a hole in my living room ceiling for over a month. The landlord was in the process of fixing it. I finally called. I was trying not to, because what do I do if my landlord, if I have an issue with my landlord? It's hard to find a place in Boston with low income. So it's like, if you have a place, you need to stay there, because if you don't, where are you going? So I'm stuck in a position where I don't want to call, but then I finally call because it's like, you're not even trying to fix it. Inspectional services comes in. Not only do they pass the inspection, they say, well, he's doing the work. We're going to give him however many days to do the work. He came in, he threw up a ceiling when it was still wet in there. And he did the work, they passed it. Not only did they pass it, but now he was able to get a rent increase. And my daughter's ceiling is still sometimes leaking in her room. And he's like, there's nothing he can do because the person lives on the 3rd floor. And he even said to me one time, like, you know what? I'm so sick of it because the person on the 3rd floor is doing whatever, and then you're complaining. I could just sell the building. So now here I am when I know that landlords are selling their buildings to developers. So once the developers get it, what recourse do I have now? I'm going to be leaving. So now I'm just stuck here, and then have to pay a rent increase also when it's not even up to the standards that it was when I moved in. I had a different landlord. So that landlord already exchanged the property. And so now I have a new landlord who's just making money off the property till he's ready to sell it, and not anytime anything goes wrong, he's either self-fixing it himself, which means that in 2 weeks I'm calling again, or I have to wait forever, and he has some contractors that are not, they're just like, I don't know, I don't want to say friends of his, but people that he's helping out to contract because it costs him less to fix stuff, and then they make money in the process, but is it really fixed? So when the inspectional services are friends with the landlord and they're passing stuff, how are we able to hold them accountable as tenants? Like, what recourse do we have to go beyond that? Because I haven't been able to see that, and I haven't been able to do that. So I'm just here, just trying to make sure me and my kids have a place to stay, because I don't know where I'm gonna go if I leave here, because I can't afford places in Boston.
Thank you so much, Marquise. I'm going to have my staff follow up with you. I don't want to do it on the public hearing, but just to figure out, where you are and who your counselor is and how we can help. Because I hear your frustration, and obviously it's very real in your life right now. So I think, like I said, I don't think it makes sense to do personal business on the Zoom, but thank you for reaching out and testifying today. And I think it raises the bigger question, and it relates to both pieces of public testimony. I mean, any system that we have to improve the state of rental inspections in the city, I mean, a big piece of what it has to do is give renters confidence, right? Confidence that your complaints get taken seriously, that they'll be followed up on, that there's data, that things don't kind of disappear into a black hole, right? And I think as counselors, that's that concern that sort of we have these mechanisms, but then at some point things just kind of, they from the perspective of the renter kind of disappear into a black hole is a big concern that we hear a lot of the time. And that's not to knock the really hard work that our inspectional services folks do, but I think that, we owe that to you as members of the public, that kind of transparency. So I appreciate you both raising that, and it's definitely a big motive force on kind of us having the hearing today. So,
and I just wanted to say, yeah, that was I use myself as an example, not to just have my personal business out there, but just to say I know that I'm not the only one that happens to, if they're bold enough to do it. I know they're just doing it. So that's what I wanted to just put out there.
And that's why it means a lot to have you testify, because I agree, you're far from alone in the city. So, all right. Joanna, did you want to add a quick word, or I'm just about to wrap up?
I do. I just wanted to say that Marquisha, if you ever want to reach out to me, my name is on the screen, and you can put @Gmail, because I've got a bunch of people that I'm working with in Charlestown. They're going through a very similar situation, and power in numbers. So it's Joanna Hines, which you see on the screen, @Gmail.
I'm going to write that down right now. And also, I work with a organization called Dorchester Not for Sale. So cool. We can kind of link up, because it is power in numbers.
Absolutely. And there's a lot of numbers. I'll tell you, they're coming out. Madam Chair, I would just like to follow up on my one really important question, and that is, will you and Councillor Braden look at this minor modification that I'm going to send you right now? It's a snapshot that defines what the new deal is, which is the replacement units are no longer deeply affordable. If the people that are there today come back, technically they're deeply affordable. But for those of them that don't, those open up to a whole new pool of people, and it's not the same pool.
So Joanna, I'm happy to look at that if you send it to me. I will just say, because I know something about this area, that public housing, the federal public housing program itself is in fact eligible up to 80% of AMI. And so the issue is that although the vast majority of people that the BHA houses are under the 30% AMI threshold, actually, if you limit the units there, then we do have families that, right, they live in public housing, but they get to 50, 60, 70% AMI, and then they're over income and they're expelled but that's not actually, with the federal system, that's not supposed to happen. So I'm happy to take a look at it. I imagine though that some of those regulatory.
That makes sense. I guess my hope is that the replacement units that they will reflect the hardworking families that live there today. They're going to be, not limit people from doing better, but at least not kick the people that are there today into the homeless population. Because my friend Louis Elisa from Roxbury would say, Boston has lost 5,000 units of public housing. We're redoing public housing and we're making it workforce housing, which is important, but the public housing people need to go somewhere. And I think they should, this is.
Absolutely. Yeah, strongly agree. If it has to stay, the replacement units for public housing have to stay housing for, really low income folks and keep them in the city. And it's a public good to have those people be able to continue to access the units.
And it's also to the developer's advantage and perhaps the city's advantage to have people that make a little bit more money taking up those spots. There are people in Charlestown that would like to see that whole development be white. It's ugly. And that's not what I want. I want this neighborhood to be diverse and not just in a concentrated acre or two.
Yeah, I'm confident that the council shares that goal. Thank you again for testifying.
Thank you.
And thanks again, Councilor Braden, for bringing this matter up, and to everybody who joined us, both from ISD and from Toronto, New York, and Chicago today. We really appreciate it. With that, this hearing is adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, everyone.